How did you get out when you got locked in a sinking car? I woke up to freezing water pouring through the door seals and my head throbbing where it had hit the steering wheel. The car was tilting forward at a steep angle, and I could hear the hiss of air escaping as lake water rushed in through every gap. My seatbelt was jammed and the driver's side window was spiderwebbed but not broken. Through the cracked glass, I could see nothing but black water and the faint glow of my headlights illuminating silk clouds. I tried the door handle, and it wouldn't budge. Water pressure on the outside was already too strong. I was trapped in a sinking car with maybe 2 minutes before it went under completely, and I had no memory of how I got here. The last thing I remembered was leaving the courthouse after testifying against my former partner Dominic Carver for evidence tampering. He'd looked at me across the courtroom with pure hatred and mouthed the words, "You're dead." I'd walked to my car in the parking garage feeling nervous but telling myself he was in custody and couldn't touch me. Now I was sinking into a lake and my brain was screaming that this wasn't an accident. The water was up to my chest and rising fast. I reached for my phone, but the cup holder was empty. No phone, no way to call for help. The car's electronics were dead so the windows wouldn't roll down. I forced myself to think through the panic. Standard advice for sinking cars was to wait until the pressure equalized, then open the door, but I didn't know if I had enough time for that. The water was so cold it felt like knives against my skin, and my fingers were already going numb. I needed to break a window, but the safety glass was designed not to shatter easily. I looked around for something heavy, and my hand found the metal tire iron wedged under the passenger seat. Someone had put it there deliberately. Someone had planned this. I grabbed the tire iron and swung it at the driver's side window with everything I had. The glass cracked deeper, but didn't break. I hit it again and again while the water rose to my shoulders. On the 5th hit, the window finally shattered outward, and lake water exploded through the opening. The force knocked me back against my seat, and suddenly the car was filling twice as fast. I'd just accelerated my own drowning, but at least now I had an exit. I sucked in the last pocket of air near the roof and pulled myself toward the broken window. My seatbelt was still jammed and holding me back. I sawed at it with a jagged piece of window glass cutting my palm open, but finally feeling the belt snap free. The water was over my head now, and the car was still sinking fast. I pulled myself through the broken window and felt glass tear through my jacket and into my side. The pain was immediate and sharp, but I kept moving because staying meant dying. I was out of the car and swimming upward, but I couldn't see anything in the murky darkness. My lungs were already burning, and I had no idea how deep I was or which way was actually up. Then I saw light above me, faint and distant, but definitely light. I kicked harder, ignoring the pain in my side and the way my limbs were going heavy from cold. My head broke the surface, and I gasped in air so cold it hurt my throat. I was in the middle of a lake, surrounded by darkness, with lights from a distant shore, maybe 200 yards away. The current was pulling me sideways, and I could feel blood from my side wound, making the water around me warm. I started swimming toward shore, using a side stroke that wouldn't aggravate the cut. Every few strokes, I looked back to see if anyone was coming to help, but the shore was dark and empty. Nobody had seen me go in. Nobody knew I was here. I swam for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 minutes. My arms felt like concrete, and my legs barely responded to my commands. The cold was shutting my body down piece by piece. My hand hit mud, and I pulled myself onto the shore, collapsing in the shallows. I lay there, shaking violently and trying to catch my breath. I could see my car's headlights still glowing underwater about 50 yards out, getting dimmer as it sank deeper. I needed to get warm and get help, but I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone and no idea where I was. I stood up and immediately felt dizzy. Blood loss and hypothermia were a bad combination. I pressed my hand against the cut on my side and started walking along the shoreline looking for lights or a road or anything. After 20 minutes, I saw a small fishing cabin with a truck parked outside. I stumbled toward it and pounded on the door. An old man opened it, holding a flashlight, and his eyes went wide when he saw me. He said, "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" I said, "Car accident. I need to call police." He pulled me inside and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, then handed me his phone. I dialed 911 and told the dispatcher I'd been in a car accident at Mercer Lake and needed police and ambulance. The dispatcher asked if I was injured, and I said yes, but I'm out of the water. She said help was on the way and to stay on the line. The old man, whose name was Floyd, brought me a towel and asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded, and he disappeared into his kitchen. I sat on Floyd's couch, shaking under the blanket and replaying everything in my head. I testified against Dominic this morning. The trial ended at 4. I'd walked to my car around 5, and I remembered unlocking it and getting in. Then nothing until I woke up sinking. Someone had knocked me unconscious and driven my car into the lake. Someone had tried to kill me and make it look like an accident. Dominic was in county jail, so he couldn't have done it himself, but he had friends, cops who'd worked with him for years and who probably thought I was a rat. Floyd came back with coffee, and I wrapped my hands around the mug, trying to absorb the warmth. He asked if I wanted to tell him what happened, and I said, "Someone tried to kill me." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I believe you." We sat in silence until red and blue lights appeared outside. 2 sheriff's deputies came to the door, and Floyd let them in. The younger deputy asked my name, and I said, "Kyle Brennan, I'm a detective with Metro PD." The older deputy's expression changed, and he said, "Brennan, the one who testified against Carver today." I nodded and said someone knocked me out and drove my car into the lake. I just barely got out. The younger deputy radioed for an ambulance, and the older one whose badge said Sheriff Hollis asked if I saw who did it. I said no, I was unconscious, but it had to be connected to the Carver case. Hollis exchanged a glance with his partner and said we'll need to investigate thoroughly. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I asked what that meant, and he said, Metro PD has some corruption issues right now, and we need to make sure we document everything properly. I realized he was implying I might have staged this. I said, you think I drove my car into a lake and cut myself up for attention? Hollis said, I'm not saying that, I'm saying we need to be careful. The ambulance arrived and paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher. They cut away my wet clothes and started working on the gash in my side. One of them said this needs stitches, but it's not life-threatening. They wrapped me in heated blankets and started an IV. During the ride to the hospital, I kept thinking about Hollis's skepticism. If the local sheriff didn't believe me, then whoever tried to kill me might try again. I was a witness in a major corruption case, and now I was a target. At the hospital, they stitched up my side and treated me for mild hypothermia. A doctor said I was lucky the water wasn't colder or I'd have been in serious trouble. She asked if I had someone to call, and I gave her my girlfriend's number. Nina arrived an hour later, and I could see she'd been crying. She hugged me carefully, avoiding my bandaged side, and said, I thought you were dead. When you didn't come home, I called the station, and they said you'd left hours ago. I told her everything and watched her face go from relieved to terrified. She said, we need to get you protection, you can't go home. I said, I know, but I don't know who to trust. Half the department probably thinks I'm a traitor for testifying against Dominic. Nina pulled out her phone and said, I'm calling my brother. Her brother Anton was a federal prosecutor, and if anyone could help, it was him. She reached him and explained the situation, then handed me the phone. Anton said, Kyle, I need you to listen carefully. Don't talk to anyone from Metro PD except Captain Walsh. She's clean, and she's been cooperating with our investigation. Everyone else is suspect until we sort this out. I need you to come to the federal building tomorrow morning, and we'll get you into protective custody. I asked if that was really necessary, and Anton said someone just tried to murder you, so yes. He gave me an address and told me to come in through the back entrance at 8. I hung up and Nina squeezed my hand. She said, you're staying at my place tonight and I'm not taking no for an answer. The hospital discharged me around midnight with instructions to rest and watch for signs of infection. Nina drove us to her apartment, and I collapsed on her couch, still feeling the cold in my bones. She made tea and sat next to me, and we didn't talk for a long time. Finally, she said, do you regret testifying? I thought about it and said, no, Dominic planted evidence to close cases and sent innocent people to prison. Someone had to stop him. Nina said, even if it costs you everything. I looked at her and said, especially then. The next morning, I woke up sore and stiff with my side throbbing. Nina had left a note saying she went to work, but would check on me later. I showered carefully, keeping the bandage dry, and changed into clothes she'd left out for me. At 7:30, I called a cab and gave the driver the federal building's address. During the ride, I kept checking the mirrors to see if anyone was following us. The cab dropped me at the back entrance, and I went inside where a federal agent was waiting. He introduced himself as Agent Marks and said Anton was expecting me. He led me through security and up to the 5th floor where Anton had his office. Anton looked exhausted and had files spread across every surface. He said, Kyle, thank you for coming. We need to debrief you about last night, and then we're moving you to a safe house. I asked for how long, and he said until the trial ends, and we've arrested everyone involved in the corruption ring. I said that could be months, and Anton said yes, but you're the key witness. Without your testimony, the case falls apart. He pulled out a recorder and asked me to describe everything from leaving the courthouse to waking up in the sinking car. I went through it step by step, including the tire iron under the seat and my missing phone. Anton made notes and said the tire iron is interesting because it suggests premeditation. Someone wanted you to have a way out, but only if you were smart enough and strong enough to use it. I asked what that meant, and he said, it means whoever did this wanted it to look accidental, but also wanted plausible deniability. If you died, it's a tragic accident. If you survived, you can't prove it was attempted murder because you have no witnesses and no memory of the attack. I felt sick, realizing how carefully this had been planned. Anton continued saying, we've been investigating Metro PD for 18 months. Dominic Carver was just the beginning. We have evidence of at least 8 officers involved in evidence tampering, bribery, and witness intimidation. Your testimony about Dominic's methods opened the door to prosecuting the others. That makes you extremely valuable and extremely vulnerable. I asked who else was involved, and Anton said, I can't tell you that yet, but Captain Walsh is helping us identify the bad actors. Agent Marks came back and said the safe house is ready. I followed him down to the garage where a black SUV was waiting. We drove for 40 minutes into the suburbs and pulled up to a nondescript ranch house with bars on the windows. Mark said you'll have 2 agents with you at all times and will rotate shifts every 12 hours. Don't leave the house and don't contact anyone except through approved channels. I asked about Nina, and he said she knows where you are and will arrange supervised visits. The house was furnished but sterile with the feeling of a place nobody actually lived in. I spent the first day pacing and thinking and trying not to go crazy from boredom. The agents wouldn't tell me anything about the investigation, and I had no phone or computer. On the second day, Anton visited and brought files for me to review. He said, "I need you to look at these incident reports and tell me if you notice any patterns." I spent hours going through reports of arrests and evidence logs. Slowly, I started seeing it. Cases where evidence appeared that hadn't been in the initial reports, witness statements that contradicted earlier accounts, confessions obtained during unmonitored interrogation sessions. It was all there if you knew what to look for. I made a list of cases that seemed suspicious, and Anton photographed every page. He said this is exactly what we needed. These cases give us probable cause to obtain warrants for personnel files and internal communications. I asked how long until trial, and he said 3 weeks. Dominic's lawyer is pushing for dismissal based on procedural issues, but the judge denied it. I asked if Dominic knew I was in protective custody, and Anton said probably. Word gets around. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about everyone who wanted me dead. I'd worked with some of these cops for years. I'd trusted them with my life. Now, they saw me as the enemy because I'd chosen justice over loyalty. The third day dragged by with nothing to do but watch old movies and eat microwave meals. On the fourth day, Agent Mark said I had a visitor, and Nina came in looking stressed. She hugged me and said, "I've been so worried. They won't tell me anything except that you're safe." I said I'm going crazy in here, but it's better than being dead. She showed me her phone and said the news is covering your accident. They're saying you drove off a boat ramp and barely escaped. No mention of foul play or the corruption case. I asked if she'd been contacted by anyone from Metro PD, and she said yes. Detective Strand called asking if she'd heard from me. I felt my blood run cold. Strand was Dominic's partner and one of the names on my suspicious cases list. Nina said I told him I didn't know where you were, and he said that was probably smart. Then he asked if you'd mentioned anything about other investigations before you disappeared. I said absolutely not, and he just laughed and hung up. I told Nina not to answer. If he called again, and she said I already blocked his number. She stayed for an hour, and we talked about everything except the case. When she left, I felt lonelier than before. Agent Marks must have seen it on my face because he said the waiting is the hardest part. You're doing the right thing. I said, doesn't feel like it. On day 6, Anton came back with news. He said we arrested 4 more officers this morning, including Detective Strand. We executed search warrants on their homes and found burner phones with messages coordinating your accident. One of them kept a backup recording of the conversation where they planned it. I asked why anyone would record themselves planning a murder, and Anton said, criminals are often stupid. They wanted proof they'd followed orders in case something went wrong. I asked whose orders, and Anton's expression went dark. He said that's the part you're not going to believe. The messages referenced someone called the Captain, but it's not Captain Walsh. We think there's another supervisor involved, someone higher up the chain who's been running this corruption ring for years. I felt the room spin. Someone high-ranking had ordered my death, and that person was still out there. Anton said we're analyzing the messages to identify communication patterns and cross-referencing with personnel assignments. We'll find them. I asked what happened with the recording, and Anton said it's detailed. They drugged your coffee at the courthouse cafeteria. You were unconscious before you reached your car. They loaded you in and drove to Mercer Lake. The tire iron was Strand's idea. He thought it would look better if you at least tried to escape. I felt rage building in my chest. These were cops, people who swore to protect and serve. They'd planned my murder with the same casual professionalism they'd bring to any operation. Anton said the trial starts in 1 week. We're adding attempted murder charges against Strand and the others. Your testimony will cover both the evidence tampering and the attempt on your life. I said I'll be there. Anton hesitated, then said there's something else. We found your car. Crime scene techs pulled it from the lake and processed it. Your blood was on the broken window glass, which corroborates your escape. But they also found something unexpected. There was a GPS tracker hidden under the rear bumper installed recently. I asked what that meant, and Anton said someone was monitoring your movements, probably to establish patterns and find the right moment for the attack. We're tracing the tracker's registration, but it was purchased with cash from a store with no working cameras. I said, so we're at a dead end, and Anton said, not necessarily. The tracker logged data to a cloud server, and we're working on accessing those records. If we can see who logged in to check your location, we can identify the captain. I spent the next 3 days reviewing my testimony with Anton, making sure every detail was accurate and defensible. He drilled me on cross-examination questions and how to stay calm under pressure. He said Dominic's lawyer will try to paint you as a disgruntled officer with a vendetta. You need to stay focused on the facts. On day 12, Nina visited again and told me she'd been followed. She said a gray sedan tailed her from work to the grocery store. When she tried to lose it by taking random turns, it stayed right behind her. She only lost it by driving into a police station parking lot. I told Anton immediately, and he assigned protective detail to Nina. He said they're trying to find leverage against you. If they can't get to you directly, they'll go after the people you care about. The night before trial, I barely slept running through my testimony over and over. Agent Marks drove me to the courthouse at dawn, and we entered through a service entrance. Federal marshals were everywhere creating a security perimeter. I was taken to a witness room where Anton briefed me one last time. He said the judge approved our motion to introduce the GPS tracker evidence and the recorded planning conversation. Dominic's lawyer is furious, but there's nothing he can do. The defense will argue the recordings are inadmissible, but we have proper chain of custody. I asked if they'd identified the captain yet, and Anton said not yet, but we're close. I was called to testify mid-morning and walked into a packed courtroom. Dominic sat at the defense table looking thinner than I remembered. His eyes found mine, and I saw pure hatred there. The prosecutor asked me to describe my former partner's evidence tampering methods, and I spent 2 hours detailing specific cases where Dominic had planted drugs, falsified reports, and coerced confessions. The jury looked horrified. Dominic's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively, asking if I had any proof beyond my word. I said yes, I have documented inconsistencies in evidence logs and witness statements that only make sense if evidence was planted after the fact. The lawyer asked if I was aware I was facing internal affairs investigation for making false accusations, and I said, yes, I'm aware that's how corruption protects itself. The judge sustained an objection, but the point was made. After my testimony about evidence tampering, the prosecutor moved to the attempted murder charges. He played the recorded conversation where Strand and the others planned to drug me and sink my car in the lake. The audio was clear and damning. Strand's voice saying, "Make sure the tire iron is accessible, we don't want it to look too obvious." Another voice responding, "He won't have time to use it, the cold water will kill him in minutes." Strand replying, "Good." The jury looked shocked, and several were taking notes. The prosecutor asked if I recognized the voices, and I identified Strand and 2 others. Then he asked about the GPS tracker. I testified that I'd had no knowledge of it until after the attack, and that its placement indicated sophisticated surveillance. The prosecutor introduced phone records showing Strand had accessed the tracker's data multiple times in the week before the attack. The defense had no effective response. Their whole strategy collapsed when faced with recorded evidence of their client's planning murder. The trial continued for 3 more days, with additional witnesses and forensic evidence. On the final day, the prosecutor called a surprise witness. FBI agent Carmichael took the stand and testified about the GPS tracker investigation. He said we traced the cloud server access logs and identified a user account registered to a Metro PD administrator. The account belonged to Deputy Chief Franklin Russo. The courtroom erupted, and the judge had to call for order. Russo was a 30-year veteran and one of the most respected members of command staff. Agent Carmichael continued saying we executed a warrant for Deputy Chief Russo's electronic devices and found extensive communications coordinating the corruption ring. He was the captain referenced in the planning messages. He ordered the hit on Detective Brennan because he knew the investigation was closing in. I felt vindicated and sick at the same time. Russo had been at the courthouse the day I testified. He'd shaken my hand and told me I was doing the right thing, all while planning to have me killed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts for Dominic and the others. Russo was arrested that evening at his home and charged with conspiracy to commit murder along with racketeering and corruption charges. Anton called me at the safe house and said it's over. You can go home now. I asked if it was really safe, and he said we arrested everyone involved in the plot. The corruption ring is broken. There might be others we haven't identified yet, but they'll be too scared to move against you now. I packed my few belongings and Agent Marks drove me back to the city. Nina was waiting at her apartment, and when I walked in, she grabbed me and didn't let go for a long time. She said I was so scared they'd get to you before the trial ended. I said it's over now, we can go back to normal. But even as I said it, I knew normal was gone forever. I'd betrayed the blue wall of silence, and that made me a pariah to half the department. Captain Walsh called the next day and said, "Kyle, I know coming back will be difficult, but we need good cops now more than ever. I'm offering you a position in the reformed Internal Affairs Division. You'd be investigating corruption and rebuilding trust." I thought about it and said, I need time to decide. The truth was, I didn't know if I could go back. Every time I sat in a car, I felt the water rising and the panic of being trapped. Every time I saw a Metro PD uniform, I wondered if that officer had known about the plot and stayed silent. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Dominic's sentencing hearing was scheduled. I attended and watched him stand before the judge. The prosecutor asked for the maximum sentence, citing the severity of the crimes and the betrayal of public trust. Dominic's lawyer made a half-hearted plea for leniency that nobody believed. The judge gave Dominic 15 years for evidence tampering and conspiracy to commit murder with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Russo got 25 years and Strand got 18. When Dominic was led out of the courtroom in chains, he looked at me one last time and mouthed, "I should have killed you myself." I felt nothing. A month later, I accepted Captain Walsh's offer and joined Internal Affairs. My first case was reviewing complaints against officers who'd been close to Russo's crew. I found patterns of excessive force and evidence mishandling that had been ignored for years. We opened investigations into 12 officers and forced 6 into early retirement. The department started mandatory ethics training and installed new oversight mechanisms. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. Nina and I moved in together, and slowly I started sleeping through the night without nightmares of drowning. I never went back to Mercer Lake, and I sold my car to buy something that didn't remind me of that night. Sometimes I think about Floyd, the old man who let me use his phone and gave me coffee while I shook from hypothermia. I went back to thank him a few months later and found his cabin empty with a for sale sign out front. A neighbor said Floyd had moved to Arizona to be near his daughter. I hope he knows his kindness saved my life in more ways than one. The corruption cases generated dozens of appeals and lawsuits from convicted defendants claiming evidence tampering. Anton's office had to review every case Dominic and Russo had touched, going back 15 years. 37 convictions were overturned, and 18 people were released from prison. Each release was a reminder of how much damage corrupt cops could do. I testified at parole hearings and appeals, helping to explain what had been done to these people. Some were guilty and got their convictions reinstated through clean evidence. Others were innocent and walked free finally. Captain Walsh retired after 2 years and recommended me to replace her. I became the youngest captain in Metro PD history and the most hated by the old guard. But I had the support of the mayor and the community, and slowly we rebuilt trust one case at a time. 3 years after nearly drowning in that sinking car, I stood at a press conference announcing new accountability measures. A reporter asked if I ever regretted testifying against my former partner, and I said no, because justice is more important than loyalty to corrupt colleagues. That quote got picked up nationally, and I received threats for weeks afterward, but I also received letters from people thanking me for standing up and doing what was right, even when it was hard. Those letters kept me going when the job felt overwhelming. Nina and I got married in a small ceremony with Anton officiating and only family present. We didn't invite anyone from Metro PD because I still didn't know who I could trust completely. On our honeymoon in Colorado, I finally told her everything I'd felt during those moments underwater. The absolute certainty that I was going to die alone in the dark. The choice to fight anyway, even when it seemed hopeless. The relief of breaking the surface and breathing again. She held my hand and said, "You survived because you refused to give up, and that's what I love about you." 5 years after the trial, I ran into Detective Strand's ex-wife at a coffee shop, and she approached me carefully. She said, "I want you to know I divorced him when I found out what he did. I couldn't stay married to someone capable of that." She asked if I hated him, and I said no, I pity him, because he threw away everything for loyalty to the wrong people. I visit Mercer Lake once a year now and stand on the shore where I crawled out of the water half dead from cold and blood loss. I think about how close I came to dying and how many small choices added up to survival. Floyd answering his door, the tire iron under the seat, the GPS tracker being traceable, Anton fighting for justice, Nina refusing to let me isolate myself. Every piece mattered, and every person who helped me deserved credit for the fact that I was still alive. Metro PD is better now, but not perfect. Corruption still exists in pockets, and probably always will. But we catch more of it earlier, and we don't protect criminals who wear badges. The department will never be what it should be, but it's closer than it was, and that has to be enough. Last month, I got a letter from Dominic in prison saying he wanted to apologize for what happened and asking if I'd visit. I threw it away without responding because some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness. He made his choices, and he's living with the consequences. I made mine, and I'd make them again, because a sinking car in a dark lake taught me that survival means refusing to surrender, even when everything says you should. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now, and let me know your take in the comments.